Star Wars has a really underrated business story. I decided to do some research, and here's what I found. In 1971, George Lucas was just 27 years old when he founded Lucasfilm, and on that same day, he actually also released a feature film called THX 1378, which did pretty well, but it wasn't as successful as his next release, which was American Graffiti. And while he released American Graffiti, he actually did a similar thing where he built another business around it. Industrial Light and Magic was the name of the business at the time. And then he put that under Lucasfilm. So he already had a couple divisions within Lucasfilm that were operating as a business. And American Graffiti actually ended up getting honored by the United States government and being in the Hall of Fame later. So a well-respected movie on just his second movie attempt. But in 1977, the summer of 77, after a couple delays, Star Wars was released, and with an $11 million budget, they were able to turn it into over $775 million in the box office performance. So if you're looking at this as a business, that's a 70x return, and not a 10-year outlook like most VCs would hope for that type of return, but in a 1-year outlook. And the impressive part was what George Lucas did after this. So because of the success of the film, he did two things really quickly. He first copyrighted the entire brand and made sure he had all the rights to the intellectual property behind Star Wars itself, even hiring someone to run that division. When you have $775 million in profit, you're able to do those types of things, but not everyone does. And so that was, the first step of a really impressive move by George Lucas. But he did a second thing where he then bought the Skywalker Ranch and turned that into essentially like a co-working for filmmakers. So he would have some of his more experienced friends that he knew in the industry teach and interact and hang out, but also it was a place for younger filmmakers and aspiring filmmakers to interact with each other, maybe rub shoulders with some bigger filmmakers and get some extra equipment, some extra advice, very much like what we see in the co-working world today, but really niched down to the filmmakers and a lot earlier than anyone else thought of co-working. And people think it's a novel concept today, but George Lucas was doing it way back when, which is really, really impressive. And now the story gets a little bit more interesting because after this, he did one more thing, which is really cool. And he was the first film studio to release, video games. Some of the earlier 80s iterations weren't that spectacular in terms of, people getting excited about it and playing them over and over again. But he had a lot of divisions of the business, the Star Wars IP, ILM, Industrial Light and Magic, all under Lucasfilm. And he actually decided to sell one of those organizations off to Steve Jobs, which later became Pixar. And Pixar, as some of you know, was acquired by Disney, sold from Steve Jobs in 2005, 2006. But not many people know that was built by George Lucas. The asset itself, the business itself was built and created by George Lucas, was under Lucasfilm for some time. And George Lucas just knew that he'd be able to recreate / focus on a few other of his animation arms, his 3D arms that would be able to do all of that and still work with Pixar too. So it was a no-brainer decision, and one of George Lucas's, first exits, if you will, in the world of business, and is often overlooked. So I thought that was really interesting. I didn't even know that till doing this research. So really cool tidbit as a part of the overall story here. And that leads us into kind of the prequel trilogies. These are, at this point, they've been approved in the works. The first one released in 99 and then early 2000s and then 2005 for Revenge of the Sith specifically. But they had another great performance. So we can see here that overall they had a 7.4x ROI on their total budget to box office performance alone. And why I keep iterating box office performance alone is because right after that first movie, they had a ton of intellectual property, a ton of merch, a ton of things like that that were really doing well. And specifically, where we're going next is their first wave of good video games. So they had, like I said, some early ones that were more so some flash games, essentially on the computer. But then they released their first wave of console games on the early Xbox and PlayStation. And these games, show them on the screen right now, give a lot of people a lot of nostalgia. My personal favorite is Star Wars Battlefront 2. I know a lot of people really enjoyed that game, and no, it's not the one by EA, although it is a great game that EA made. It doesn't have the magic that Battlefront 2 had, the original Star Wars Battlefront 2 in 2005 release. And the reason for these games were really to build. You can see some of the screenshots here on the games themselves. They were to build hype around the movie, so it was all focused on the prequel trilogy. So with that said, like the ROI on these prequel trilogies are still exceptionally high if you factor in the other avenues that it's feeding. And again, those avenues are trying to get more eyes on the movies, but a really good, really underrated business strategy, right? From a film studio to build all these video games out and be the first to do it, and then actually be decent at it. I can remember going to a Blockbuster, remember that, and seeing some movie-based games and just knowing that they were going to be horrible, looking at them, understanding how they were horrible. Before I even got it, I tested a few, obviously being interested as a young kid, and they were bad. But Star Wars had something different going on. It was a different way to move around and a different storyline, and it added to the movie as opposed to just trying to be a carbon copy of it and make you play the movie itself. It was more so, hey, this is like a side thing that plays into the movie's storyline overall. And I think that was where they really did a good job at pulling off this game success. And the biggest success actually came in their Lego Star Wars series. So those games sold really well. Their number one selling game out of all their games was the complete saga of the Lego Star Wars series, with over 15 million copies sold. And most of those copies were considered around like the $60, $59.99 mark. I think the average sales price was over $50 for these particular copies. And you can do the math, but that's an exceptional return on those games. But after the games, the prequel trilogies, there was a lot of really big interest in what was next for Star Wars. A lot of people wanted more to bridge the gap between certain storylines and add a little bit more. We had a lot of Legends stuff in the universe, but it was time for a new era, at least in George Lucas's eyes, because at this point, a lot of these storylines are contradictory, and people were reading different books from different authors that had completely different narratives, and other authors would jump in and play off one author's narrative but not another. And so it became kind of a jumbled mess in terms of like storyline and canon. And George knew this, and I think he made the right call, although it hasn't been a perfect ride. But 2012, George Lucas decided to sell the rights to all of Lucasfilm and Star Wars, the whole shebang, to Disney for a few billion in stocks and cash. And now it's worth, with the stock considered today, it's actually worth over $10 billion in terms of that transaction. So huge exit. Second exit, I guess technically his other one eventually led its way to Disney as well. But funny enough, he exited Pixar to Steve Jobs in the 80s, 86, and then exited the whole thing to Disney in 2012. From there, Disney did a good job at formalizing the canon of the story. So they took away a lot of the non-major production Legends books and turned them into Legends. They call them Legends now. And anything that was major produced, published, was considered canon. And then they decided to start producing the next wave of content, shows, as well as the sequel trilogy, if you will, which there's a lot of up in the air about how well those did. But as far as the business aspect of it goes, it did do really well with a solid ROI, not as high as the 7.4 that the prequel saw, but according to the budget and performance numbers, it's still over a 3x return on the budget to the box office performance. The games have gotten a lot better in terms of game engine. EA does all of the games now under Disney, and really good job at building out the storyline, making sure that it's cohesive. It's not perfect, a lot of hate under some of the sequel trilogy stuff, but Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni have a lot of cool things in the work for Mando and Andor, and just maybe rewriting some of the trilogies. The Star Wars guys that I follow here on YouTube have been talking about it, at least. So really exciting stuff there. I bring that up because I want to now mention that these shows alone, right, Mando and Kenobi at least, were 90 million and 100 million respectively for their season 1 budgets, or one season budgets. I think it's the new Mando and the latest Kenobi, to be specific. But regardless, that came a long way from the original $11 million budget for the first Star Wars movie that ever happened. And so it's a pretty wild story to consider. They made plenty of other movies at Lucasfilm. Indiana Jones did the graphics for Star Trek as well. So a lot of crazy, different successes that they had. But when you take that all in, they really just focused on Star Wars from the very beginning. They saw the huge success, and instead of, taking that and building what they wanted to or writing it completely, they focused on it. They understood that's what the people wanted, and then they iterated and built out a bunch of unique things within that framework, and then from time to time would do other little projects, with their studio and talent, because it was a business. But business thrived off Star Wars. And so today, just to recap, the Star Wars brand business is worth over $70 billion. And the Lucasfilm film production studio is estimated around $4.2 billion. So over $74 billion in total value between those two businesses. And it was started by a 27-year-old filmmaker that launched a movie on the same day as the business, primarily just to make sure that he had some good vehicle for doing his taxes and making sure he was able to just pay everyone properly. And now it is a $74 billion brand and business. So I really hope that if you stuck around to the end of this video, that you enjoyed some of the content and hopefully learned something. I know if you're a Star Wars nerd, you might have all this down. A business nerd, same thing. But there was a couple things that I found that I thought, no way that this was the case. So I hope you had that same feeling. If you like, business and entertainment style content, please consider commenting, subscribing for more, and have a good rest of your day. Peace.